Hello, welcome to a somewhat abridged episode of Rassilon Omega and That Other Guy, the podcast dedicated entirely to the secret lore of the Time Lords. So if you enjoy learning more about that incredibly nerdy stuff, please subscribe and like. Unfortunately, this is another short episode and not the Daleks, as promised, due to the fact that Sohel and the other are both unable to record today. They are apparently invading a town called Christmas on the planet Trenzalore. So apologies. I know all you wanted for Christmas was a Dalek, but not going to happen. But we will get to the Daleks. Believe me, we will. Just need a few more, a little bit more time to sort out this Christmas thing. So, but today we have a TARDIS feature of the week, and we will continue on from the last feature. Let's see here. There we go. We're going to continue on from the last TARDIS feature that supplemental video that I did, where we talked about TARDIS flight procedures and dematerialization procedures specifically, by continuing our work to work our way through the TARDIS manual here. There are, as I mentioned before, 387 stages to making a space-time jump in a TARDIS. Most of these are handled by the infrastructure subsystems automatically without the operator needing to touch any of the controls. There are only 5 steps that an operator must undertake to dematerialize a TARDIS from normal space. And there are 10 safety protocols that should also be enacted as part of this sequence, though perhaps not strictly necessary if you're feeling a bit renegade-ish. So last time we talked about settings 1, 2, and 3, setting the helmic orienters so that the TARDIS knows where it currently is, setting the navigational slide control so that the TARDIS knows where you want it to go, and setting the time-space forward-backward control so that the TARDIS's trans-power system can be properly configured for this sort of flight and energy needs that are going to be required. Today we're going to talk about the next 4 steps, broadly titled computer acceptance and processing. And we're going to take a look at step 1 of that, calculating the epsilon coordinates. So let's see here. All right, there's the navigation station there. But we're going to take a look here specifically at that gadget there in the doctor's hands. This is what is known as a directional unit. The directional unit uses as my best guess, as far as I can tell, the directional unit uses the space-time coordinates that were entered relative to Galactic Zero Center to calculate epsilon coordinates, which are the coordinates you need, the 5-dimensional coordinates you will need to move through the space-time vortex, or rather to establish and generate a wormhole that will move you through the space-time vortex. The directional unit is a key part of the main space-time mechanism. A fully functional directional unit is essential for precise navigation and materializations. If you have one that is precisely tuned, TARDISes have been known to be able to be accurate to within a millisecond and to within 1 meter for their arrival times, which is fairly impressive given that it takes about at least 3 seconds for a TARDIS to materialize. In practice, most directional units, combined with most operators of average Time Lord skill, are generally accurate to within about 3 meters or so. So now you might be asking, epsilon coordinates, what are those? I thought we already set the coordinates in the last video. Well, epsilon coordinates, as far as I can determine, serve as a path or roadmap for the wormhole through the space-time vortex. They allowing the TARDIS to avoid any unknown regions or areas of intense time spillage. Keep in mind, when you entered the coordinates in the previous video in step 1, or step 2, rather, you were setting 4-dimensional coordinates for length, width, height, and time. into the program, into the slide controls. However, the vortex is a 5-dimensional space, and you're going to need 5-dimensional coordinates to travel through it. And that appears to be what these epsilon coordinates are. That's my guess. We know that the epsilon coordinates are different than normal coordinates, and they need to be calculated. But that they're generally done using a computer, and that they're a key part of the navigation system, but they're not the normal space-time coordinates. There's something that's been processed and calculated based off some other frame of reference. So I'm guessing that's what epsilon coordinates are, is that they are the roadmap for the actual vortex, for the actual wormhole traveling through the time-space vortex. Well, the computer usually does these calculations. Some Time Lords can and do computate epsilon coordinates in their heads. So the Doctor sometimes has been known to do this. The shorter the space-time trip, as far as how much space you are actually going to cover, or how much time you are actually going to cross, the simpler it is to calculate the epsilon coordinates. However, executing a short hop is under a certain frame, under a certain threshold, starts becoming difficult for other reasons related to the fact that TARDISes really aren't designed for short hops. They're not vortex manipulators. It's kind of like using a 747 to cross to the other end of town or something. Technically, you can do it if there's an airport at both ends, but there's probably other modes of transportation that would be more efficient than using the 747. Now, I suppose if you had to carry a whole bunch of stuff and all you had handy was a 747, you'd probably use it. The shorter, let's see. So the closer a TARDIS is to Gallifrey's time zone, the Rassilon era, which is about 3.5 billion BC, the closer the TARDIS is to that point, at the center, and physically it's located at the center of Mutter's stellian spiral galaxy, also known as the Milky Way by some people. The closer you get to those coordinates, galactic zero center, the easier it is to calculate the epsilon coordinates. The farther away you get, like if you want to run around and visit the Earth, that's 3.5 billion years after galactic zero center. So that's a little trickier for the epsilon calculations. There are some locations that can only be reached by traveling through dangerous areas of the vortex. In order to do that, you need to use the manual override to allow the TARDIS to create epsilon coordinates that will take you into such an area. Normally, the directional unit will just throw an error if you try to set something like that. So that's what epsilon coordinates are. At least that's my best guess. Once the epsilon coordinates have been calculated, the input bar is depressed. And that causes that the drums located in the ceiling of the control room above the time rotor will activate and begin to revolve and lock the coordinates into the course acceptance unit. I should have brought up a picture of that. Fortunately, I don't have one. But yes, if you remember the console used in the later Matt Smith and Peter Capaldi eras had these big rotating drums up above with all these coordinate insignias on them. And they would spin and rotate every time the TARDIS would take flight. That's the TARDIS locking those epsilon coordinates into the course acceptance unit. I believe those drums are always there. It's just in other versions of the TARDIS, the ceiling prevents you to see prevents you from seeing those rotating drums. But I think they're always there in all of the primary control room number ones. If the input bar isn't engaged, and you try to take off, continuing the dematerialization without inputting the coordinates into the course acceptance unit, the TARDIS will assume a forward reference has been filed and the ship will dematerialize and remain in limbo, awaiting epsilon coordinates and other essential flight data. So that's what would happen if you skipped this step. A TARDIS's computers require 12 minutes to reorient after each rematerialization. So apparently they reboot. That's what rebooting the directional unit takes. If a TARDIS hasn't been recently overhauled, then the operator might need to change the relativity unit before attempting a space-time jump. If this isn't done, the TARDIS could end up temporally overshooting its intended time zone. TARDIS that misjumps often finds itself at a temporal nexus point, which is a time zone where history is very easily changed, where history is a bit fragile, if you will. The very opposite of a fixed point, in fact. It's a point that's very easily malleable. So misjumps tend to drop you into places where history is at its most vulnerable. So that should be kept in mind by every operator. If no directional unit is installed in the console and you try to dematerialize, so if that little gadget the doctor's got there isn't plugged in, but is instead being held by William Hartnell, then it will cause a backfire explosion at the current coordinates and the ship will be lost in the vortex. So yeah, definitely don't try to dematerialize without your directional unit. Here we see the doctor in this picture stealing the Mark IV directional unit from the meddling monks Mark IV TARDIS console. And he ends up plugging it into his Mark I TARDIS console, and gains a certain amount of control over the TARDIS, but it does end up burning out because of, and in order to prevent the central column from being destroyed. So as a sort of a safety mechanism, the TARDIS will eventually burn out if you use the wrong Mark number of directional unit. The problem is that a Mark IV unit requires much more power to run than a Mark I, and the TARDIS is just a Mark I TARDIS console will end up burning out its destroying its central column if it is continually asked to require the hot or supply the high levels of power that a Mark IV console is or a Mark IV directional unit requires. So let's see. If the direct coordinates, this is probably where the coordinate fusing happens, when a coordinates become fused in a TARDIS. And that's what happened. The doctor did to his own TARDIS to prevent the master from having all that much control, though it appears that by using the fast return switch, probably the master is able to zip back and forth from the previous coordinates that were inputted into the Helmick orienters and the current coordinates inputted into the navigational slide controls, though the master had a bit of leeway of about 18 months in either direction. So yes, that's the directional unit. Very key, important part. It figures out your epsilon coordinates. I guess you Time Lords, smart, mathematically minded Time Lords can figure out epsilon coordinates on their own and input them manually. Which is what you would need if you wanted to go go into a dangerous area of the vortex. So, right, but that's step 4, which is really just from the operator's point of view, push the input bar. But but there's lots of important stuff that happens under the hood, so to speak, when you do that. Right, step 5. Step 5 is very easy. And simple. It doesn't, and is definitely one of those steps you can omit, but from a safety perspective, you probably should do it. Check the course. Once the epsilon coordinates have been inputted, the course can be checked on the destination monitor. The full destination display uses the format, will have the words TARDIS flight data programmed journey written across the top. And then below it, it'll say departure with the planet name and a location on the planet. And then local date line with the local date and the era in the Gallifreyan dating system, say November 23rd, 1963, in the Humanian era. And then the destination with the destination planet and and a location on the planet, say Gallifrey, the continent of wild endeavor. Local dateline, again, would give the date in the local parlance of whatever the dating system is of the place you're headed. And then the era in Gallifreyan dating. So if you were going back to Earth in the 1 million BC, it would honestly 1 million BC, that's before humans were using the BC AD notation at all, so it might actually use another notation that was more common in that era. But yes, there would be the local date and the era, a broad era in Gallifreyan datings. So yes, and you can see some of that information up there, part of that display in the picture here. So check the destination. Don't actually have to do anything, but if what reads out for planet name and location and date are wrong, it gives you a chance to abort and re-enter new coordinates before you lock yourself in and have to travel to this location. So yeah, it's a good safety step. Not some operators who get a little over cocky will skip that one. Twin navigational locks. This is another one that technically doesn't need to be done, but is one of those 10 safety protocols. Let's see here. And there are 2 navigational locks. You can see them at the bottom half of the screen, right underneath the radiation meter. Multiple sets of coordinates can be inputted into the directional unit. Any previous coordinates must be canceled, or the unit will ignore the newly inputted coordinate program until it has completed that programmed flight. So you have to cancel old units. In order to make sure people don't get confused as to how many coordinates have been inputted and whether or not the TARDIS is actually going to follow a previous set of coordinates that you didn't know, that one of the operators might not have realized or might have forgotten that they were inputted, there are the navigational locks. If departure is not imminent, one should apply the correct twin navigational lock. This will ensure that the coordinates can't be accidentally altered and that no further coordinates can be inputted into the system. So that's what that little red switch there does, is locks the coordinates in so that nobody can add any new coordinates or cancel the old coordinates. As I said, twin navigational lock, there's 2 of them there. The other one should be, locks the fast return switch. So if you're going to keep it from accidentally interfering with the navigation, if you are going to use the fast return switch, then you need to untoggle that other lock, the black switch, so that the fast return switch will then be available to be used. So we'll talk about the fast return switch in more detail in a different episode. So seventh step is adjust the Heisenberg focusing device. And let's see, there was the control for that, at least when you have your TARDIS set to that sort of brass and glass look that the 11th Doctor preferred during the early part of his era. The Heisenberg focusing device needs to be should be calibrated before dematerialization. Again, this is a step you can skip, but the Heisenberg focusing device will tend to drift out of calibration over time and with each vortex or with each space-time jump. So it should be recalibrated before each use if you want to have an accurate flight and safe flight. The focusing device is part of the zigzag plotter. And it compensates for Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. It allows the mean-free path tracker of the zigzag plotter to plan a path through the vortex despite not knowing the vortex subatomic fifth-dimensional position and state. Because the space-time vortex, the 5th dimension, is curled up in on itself into a space that is smaller than an atom. So the Heisenberg, the principles of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that's a little redundant. Anyway, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle certainly applies to calculations involving the vortex. And the Heisenberg focusing device allows you to bypass and compensate for the inability to learn both the vortex's position and state at the same time. This path that the Heisenberg focusing device plots is used to calculate how much energy the TARDIS will require for its trip through the vortex. So the TARDIS needs to kind of prepare itself and make sure it's got enough fuel in the tank, so to speak. And the Heisenberg focusing device is key to that. If you haven't calibrated it and it's drifted out of calibration, that might turn out that the flight is going to require more energy than is available. And the focusing device will not be able to throw an error and an alarm alerting you that you do not have the energy reserves necessary to make this flight. But if it's not calibrated, it won't necessarily throw the error. Obviously, if you have more energy than you need, then you're fine. Again, a step that can be skipped if you're feeling dangerous. A typical space-time jump requires about 990 omegas worth of power, and that's power, not energy. So that's the equivalent, more like watts than joules. 990 omega. An omega is a lot. We're talking power on the level of the output of a star here when we say 990 omegas. And a typical space-time jump requires about 990 omegas for the duration of the trip. If the TARDIS is only moving through space and not time, the power draw will be significantly reduced by even half. You need a minimum of 240 omegas to travel in the vortex safely. If the power output drops below 240 omegas, you're going to have serious problems, and the TARDIS will probably try to trigger an emergency rematerialization, because I'm thinking the wormhole probably can't be sustained if you have less than 240 omegas for the wormhole generator. So that's 4 more steps. Next time we will get to look at steps 18 through 15, which will cover the rest of the dematerialization. So we've still got to discuss powering up the atom accelerator, making sure that the doors are locked, undoing the locking down mechanism, releasing the time rotor handbrake, activating the inertial dampeners, engaging the harmonic generator, throwing the engine release lever, activating the master dematerialization switch, and increasing the space-time throttle. So hope you guys found that kind of interesting and a bit of fun. If you don't want to wait around too much to know the secrets of how you fly a TARDIS, you can download my TARDIS Technical Index PDF, which can be found at my website, allthingstimelord.com. So let's see. There you go. That's what it looks like. Next week, let's see what this time scanner has for us. Should be the Daleks, right? Next week, the Daleks. Oh, it's looking really fuzzy. Says outlook uncertain, concentrate and ask again yesterday. Okay, so I guess I'm not going to be able to get you an answer now. I've got to go back in time to yesterday and try the time scanner then. So until then, see you later in these time and relative dimensions in space.